Hi, so today I'm going on a date with Professor Laurent de Sutter, who is an academic, professor of legal theory. He's also author of many books, including Narco-Capitalism, and an editor. And Laurent is French-speaking. He's not French. He is from Belgium, but he comes from that culture. And I've Googled him. He's quite a snappy dresser. So I've upped my look a little bit today. I'm still wearing my cardi, yes, but I'm wearing my top. I'm wearing a skirt. And I'm wearing some boots. What am I hoping to get out of this date? Well, this date is a little bit different from normal dates because it's a date with an expert. Laurent knows a lot about Jean Baudrillard. The show is called Fatal Dates. That comes from Jean Baudrillard's book, Fatal Strategies. So I'm hoping that Laurent will talk about fatal strategies and how they could be applied to dating. And I hope he'll talk about some other terms from Baudrillard, hyperreality, objects, transparency, just to explain what those things mean. I'm also hoping that Laurent might talk a bit about his personal life, but I don't know. We'll just have to see. Hi, welcome to Fatal Dates. Our guest this week is Laurent de Sutter, who is professor of legal theory at the Free University of Brussels. Laurent is also a very distinguished, prolific author of many books, including Narco-Capitalism. He's also an editor, and I'm really honored to have him on the show today. And I should say that this is not a normal date. I've invited Laurent on because now, just before we went on, he said to me, under no circumstances was I to say that he was an expert on Baudrillard. So he's by no means an expert on Baudrillard. He's simply read a lot of Baudrillard and has some thoughts and theories about Baudrillard, which is useful to me because my podcast is called Fatal Dates because it comes from Baudrillard's book, Fatal Strategies, and I'm looking forward to just using this show as a way of talking about some basic concepts that Baudrillard has, rather than it being a strict date as such. So by no means an expert. Here is Laurent, and I also want to put. I just want to explain to Laurent that I'm just merely a novelist. I have read quite a lot of Baudrillard, and to show off to Laurent, I brought some of my Baudrillard here today. I won't go through them all, but. Can you see them? Here's some of my Baudrillard collection. I should say Fatal Strategy is one of my very favorite Baudrillard books, and I'm hoping that we can discuss that. So without further ado, thank you so much for coming on Fatal Dates, Laurent. And I wanted to ask you perhaps to begin by telling me to explain what is Baudrillard's, what does it mean to be, what is the strategy of the object? Tell me, can you explain to the viewers what Baudrillard might mean by that?
Well, I think that first, Susanna, thank you for having me, for inviting me on this date. I'm honored and flattered. In order to understand Baudrillard fully, it's always useful. I'm afraid to dive a little bit into history and the history of philosophy because one of the key things about Baudrillard is that he seems to to think out of his own hat somehow, but everything that he wrote was very deeply informed by the history of thought, especially Western thought, especially German idealism on the one hand, Marx, the recent developments of sociology in France in the 1950s, 1960s, for instance, the work of Henri Lefebvre, and of course, more classical authors. And Baudrillard, of course, there is this idea of a reversal of, the modern philosophical tradition that was set up and initiated and monumentalized somehow by Immanuel Kant. When Kant decided to develop the idea of critique around precisely the integration of the possibilities of knowledge into a subject, being in relationship to an object. And in the idea of modern critique, the object is simply literally this thing that is thrown in front of you, and that only the object, him or herself, and mostly, let's face it, himself, the subject himself can understand it. So can, let's say, crush it under the capacity of intelligence and understanding that the subject has. So that the object is something passive.
Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant, Chapter 4. The exercise of this pure cognition, however, depends upon this as its condition, that objects to which it may be applied be given to us in intuition, for without intuition the whole of our cognition is without objects, and is therefore quite void.
We could understand it that the subject conventionally has been what we conventionally call a man, and the object has been, conventionally speaking, what is not a man. Fair enough?
Yeah, absolutely. Even if Baudrillard is a bit ambiguous about that, because precisely in his personal life as a white heterosexual male with plenty of love affairs and a long personal relationship also with seduction, everything should be taken cum grano salis when we interpret him. But indeed there's that, and what Baudrillard brings to the table is this very powerful idea that at some point the objects will take some kind of a revenge upon the subject. So there's the idea that the artificial primacy of the subject upon the object is really an artificial primacy, a primacy of philosophers who refuse to understand that actually, to put it in perhaps mundane words, we exist and we live under the condition of the encounter with something that is not us as subjects, and there's this kind of rebalancing of things in favor of the object that will take its revenge upon the subject. That is something which is very powerful to me, at least. I don't know how you feel about it, Susanna, but for me that was the first thing that when I said that, I say, oh, at least somebody is giving back to objects their dignity, and it's trying to reverse the course of modern philosophy and to put the so-called passive pole into actually the most active pole of the two in this relationship, and a pole that disrupts precisely the relationship as it was posited before.
Yes, I love this idea. I'm glad to see, for you to tell me what's the first idea that really grabbed you in Baudrillard. And in a moment, I'll tell you the first idea that really grabbed me. This idea about subjects and objects and the reversibility of the power wasn't the first thing that I encountered, but it's a very powerful thing, because what he says is to be the subject is in fact to be totally in the power of the object. And by objects here, and obviously there's a lot that could be discussed here. We're talking about things that are not white men, that could be women, could be not white men, could be objects that we could eventually understand as objects. What he says is to be the subject is to have a tremendous, terrible amount of responsibility, and also to have assumed a position in the universe that is impossible, which is to be the center of the universe, to order things, to actually be able to be in the situation where you're saying, this is what I want. It's to desire things. And if you desire things, then you're lacking something. You need your desire to be fulfilled. Whereas when you're the object, you're an object of desire. You could be, you might choose to do what the subject wants, you might not. And furthermore, you have the tremendous power and privilege of playing with the subject, of perhaps giving it, perhaps not, of tweaking your power over it. And this is also, it should be understood, he says it's also about inanimate objects. I think there's a fantastic bit somewhere that I read about objects glowering at you, a table glowering at you. At least it has a purpose. At least it knows what to do with itself. At least it has a use. Whereas what are you, useless thing? I'm not talking personally about you there, Laurent, obviously. But let me tell you, since you've told me about the first thing that grabbed you about Baudrillard, I'll tell you the first thing that grabbed me. So I was reading The Perfect Crime, and I just picked it up off the bookshelf. I'm not an academic. I'm a curious person. I started reading it. I could kind of read it. I could kind of understand it. And suddenly I came to this bit about asymmetric attraction, which is what he says is, again, and there are lots of generalizations that I'm already doing here. The idea of the Matrix, so Baudrillard, obviously, the thought of Baudrillard informed the Matrix movies, although Baudrillard himself famously said the Matrix is the kind of movie that the Matrix would make about itself, and felt it was a naive rendition of his ideas. But the Matrix is what we all live in, particularly on the internet, which says, you're a little bit like this, I'm a little bit like that, but our differences are similarly different. You wear a hijab, I don't, you're a man, I'm a woman, but, we all can fit in the same ice cube trays. And the bit that I loved was that he said that's not true at all. Some differences are asymmetrical. And the differences between subjects and objects, the differences between women and men, and we should be clear here, Baudrillard is he's got evolved definitions of what women and men are. In fact, I think in Forget Foucault, he says that he defines men as those who desire and women by those who are desired. So you can apply those to whatever you want. But when he said it's asymmetric and it is effectively the women that have all the power and the men who are enthralled to the women, I love that. And I think I love that for quite base motives, because suddenly I felt like I've got all the power, and that was a good feeling. So there you go. Have I explained Baudrillard adequately there? What do you think of my explanations?
I simply love it. I quite agree with you. And then I would add, perhaps for the sake of bringing a little bit of context in this, that it's easier to understand if we also understand that in the intellectual climate of France in the 1960s. The importance that was played by some kind of a rereading of Hegel's dialectic of the master and the slave was somehow at the origin of that. You know that famously for Hegel in the phenomenology of spirits, there's the idea that the master actually, as it is taken in a dialectical relationship with the slave, the master is the master only if it's recognized as the master by the slave. Making the slave the master of the master, which in return makes, of course, the master eventually the slave of the slave, and so on and so forth, in this kind of movement where the symmetry indeed never exists, because it's a movement of displacement of qualities that reshuffles the position of everybody and reshuffles, of course, the entire ecology of relationship. So there's this idea, the idea of asymmetry with Baudrillard, because Baudrillard was also very much, influenced by German Romanticism and so on. So nothing is never fixed. Everything is always moving and transforming. And what is interested is not so much at pinpointing positions and qualities, but rather as showing how saying that an object can take its revenge upon the subject and so on and so forth, it already puts the relationship that he described into some kind of a dynamic that was itself producing the asymmetry that it was at the same time described. So there's also this experience for a reader, the experience that you see the text moving in front of you at the time you're reading it. You're not confronted to a theory that is simply a system that you should or you could even apply, but as something that is already, like sand between your fingers. It's already gliding and moving another place. So it's also an experience of reading where the object book takes its revenge upon the reader.
Well, what makes the phenomenology so gripping? Well, what Hegel does, as I guess great philosophers always do, is not answer old problems, or not directly, but they change the topic. They change what we're talking about. Well, let's begin with the obvious. Modern philosophy begins with the thought of self-consciousness, with the discovery of subjectivity, with the I think, therefore I am, that idea, that self-consciousness, right, is certain of itself, is the ground or foundation of possible other knowledge. Subjectivity is, as I understand it, self-consciousness. That is, the relation of the self to itself as a condition for a possibility of relationship to the world is constitutive of what we mean by subjectivity. To be a subject is to be in this self-conscious relation. Hegel changes the subject. He contends that the minimal unit for there to be self-conscious agency is two. That you cannot be a self-conscious agent by yourself. You are not in an immediate self-relation to yourself. On the contrary, your relationship to yourself, you being yourself, is mediated by the other. So you are, in ways that we will discover, absolutely dependent on the other, absolutely dependent on what is not you.
these kinds of quite playful ideas have sometimes made people quite irritated with Baudrillard. And before I ask you what is a fatal strategy and what does fatal mean to Baudrillard, if you would briefly just perhaps outline Baudrillard's position today, why people have been irritated with him, what the objections to Baudrillard are.
Well, the objections are very numerous depending on where you look at, where you look from. I mean, let's face it, from the point of view of those whose discipline he was officially teaching at university, namely sociology, despite having famously his degrees are in German literature, basically. So, but he eventually went to teach sociology in the university in a very singular and very anarchic way. And of course, for today's sociologists, this lacks scientificity on every ground, So scientifically speaking, this is shit because there is no bibliography, there is no field research, there is no, methodological remarks, there is no clear-cut conclusions, schemes, whatever you can imagine that makes scientificity, let's say, an apparatus, a theater. So this theater, Baudrillard never wanted to even have any interest in it. He was not. What he wanted to do was to provide an experience of reading. So an experience of reading that was an experience of perplexity somehow. And of course, the fact that he went on in the direction of something which is more of a writer's exercise, but a writer like Chuangzi was a writer, like the Chinese the great Chinese authors were writers.
A metaphysician. I read an interview with him and he said, I think of myself as a moralist and a metaphysician and a pataphysicist.
The essential core of pataphysics is anything that upsets the bourgeois culture. The bourgeoisie, anything that upsets that, which is pretty easy to do around here.
When you put the three together, you can imagine all the others saying, what the fuck is that? A metaphysician. We know that metaphysics is gone. It is supposed to have vanished and something else, the subject lost in its finitude in a world that he or she doesn't fully understand. But still, we know, we have the methods for trying and give an interpretation of it and so on. And suddenly metaphysics. Of course, with metaphysics, we imagine gods reappearing. We can imagine weird forms of truth reappearing and so on and so forth. And indeed, this idea of weirdness, perhaps, or even extraterrestriality or alienness, what was interested when he was speaking about
perhaps it is it seems to me in reading it that in fact what those things are fatal strategies, that and this is an objection I sense that people have had to him, he's not necessarily playing straight. He's saying things to provoke, which can be irritating, but he's saying things to provoke to almost like a kind of in Zen, to just make your mind go strange, to let other possibilities in, because often so few other possibilities are let in. We exist within a very set parameter. So I would like to ask you, what are fatal strategies? This show's called Fatal Dates because I'm trying to, in my own small way, Laurent, use some fatal strategies with my guests to explore if there are different ways of interacting with each other, because sometimes we can feel that the ways that we have of interacting with each other, particularly when we're different to each other, may have run their course, and I'm attempting some fatal strategies, but obviously I'm just an amateur, I'm not a philosopher or metaphysician myself. So it would be excellent to know what is your interpretation of what is a fatal strategy, please.
Oh, aren't we all amateurs, Susanna? I mean, I think it would be impossible or maybe or even absurd, I think, to talk about Baudrillard in as if it was as if he was part of some kind of a canon that we should, respect. And that's why I would have huge difficulties to offer a definition of what fatal strategies are. I mean, the idea of the fatal or fatality in Baudrillard is more a way of something that inhabits everything. And that's a way of making precisely the other strategies, the strategies of mastering, for instance, or trying to master our surrounding fail. So the idea of fatal strategies with him is more about the failures of the other strategies, the ones that pretend to be serious and solid and, and tested and so on and so forth. So, plus there's the idea that with fatal strategies, the very strategic dimension, with all that it implies in terms of reflection and plan and planification and all that, suddenly falls in such a way that fatal strategies is some kind of an oxymoron. It's some self-contradictory expression. A fatal strategy is a way for strategies to crumble, because there's something else that rebels, something else that says it's not the way it's going to happen. It's going to happen differently. But it's not fatal in the terms also of fatality, meaning by that, it will happen, then it will happen. It's not this kind of...
Not fatalistic, yes.
Yes. Absolutely. It's fatal like a course, the fatal course that things can take. And when you speak about the fatal course, it's you say it with a grin, because it's so theatrical at the same time. But it's, again, a theatricality that displaces our sense of normality towards what makes it weird, strange, and unexpected. I don't know if you agree with that.
I do agree with that. For me also, it is about, and this is implicit in what you've said, but it's about pushing things to extremes. So they go beyond what is our comfortable definition of them. And when you instead of, he says, instead of lies and truth, you should lie more than the liars. And by doing extreme lying, extraterrestrial lying, it brings some truth in, basically. And what it does is it makes fatal, as you've said, the po-faced, serious, we're doing the right thing, blah, 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 that the real world can often present to us. And the fatality is the ruining of what's supposed to be sensible, normal, logical, reasonable. And what I love about it, and this is obviously the bits that also are difficult about Baudrillard sometimes and completely can never be proven, is there is, when I read him, there is a, I was going to say religious, but I won't say that, but I will say diabolical element to it, or Manichaean element to it. And he talks about these most terrible taboos and heresies. The Manichaean taboo heresy is the one that says, you know what, the world is bad. The world is not a good thing as Christianity teaches us. It's bad and we must protect ourselves from it. And that he comes from this position, and he invokes the Manichaeans and other Cathars, other heretics of the Middle Ages and earlier, people who said, you know what, this world is created by some kind of God with a sense of humor, as he also refers to God from time to time in his texts, and we shouldn't take it too seriously. And this is very much the framework that I want to do my fatal dates out of, which is not necessarily a religious or diabolical one, but to say, instead of thinking that things can be perfect and we can find, for example, perfect connections, perfect relationships, friendships, romantic relationships with people. In fact, might it not be a healthier place to say, it's impossible, it's completely fucked up. We won't be able to do that. We'll never be able to connect to each other. You'll never understand me, I will never understand you. And we shouldn't even pretend it's so. But given that, since we know it's all messed up, why don't we see out of the embers and ruins of that if there's possible to have any sort of connection at all, given that we know that knowledge? And also, the other thing that I like very much about it is, and let's not be too explicit about it, although what I'm doing here is being very explicit about it indeed and talking about it. And anyway, hold on, I want to say something else. I'll say in a moment, I park an idea. But not to be too analytical as the so-called objective, technocratic, data-driven world teaches us to be, which is let's get precisely down into the details and work out how exactly which ruin we're going to pick up first in order to say you'll be like this and I'll be like that in it. The parked idea, maybe you know what I was going to say, is something that we said just before we came on air. You said to me that the only way to talk about Baudrillard is to betray Baudrillard, and I felt I was betraying Baudrillard there by being very specific in a strategic approach, which is everything I've read in Baudrillard teaches me to be less and less specific, or the illusion of specificity, the illusion that technology gives us, particularly data analytics, that somehow by mining one of his texts properly enough, I'll get some answers. And I said to you that I thought that was fascinating, and that I worried in doing this podcast here that by the very act of of doing a podcast about Baudrillard, I was going to enter his ideas into hyperreality, another parked concept. And I would like you to talk, if you would, in a bit and give us a definition of hyperreality, which is a word that Baudrillard coined and is obviously a very important word for his thought. And I said to you that, yes, that in a way, one needs to betray the people that one loves the most. So tell me how you think talking about Baudrillard is to betray Baudrillard.
I think that there's two ways, two different ways for betraying someone. You can betraying someone like Baudrillard by precisely being scholarly about him, and then suddenly losing all the enjoyment, because I think that it is about let's say a concept or ideas or intelligence or something like that arises from enjoyment and not from simply deduction, reasoning, and so on and so forth. So there's the erotic dimension of thinking is part of it. So trying to be erotic at the second degree is completely nonsensical. So that would be a form of betrayal.
Nonsense. May I say you're being very erotic at the second degree. Sorry, carry on.
And then, of course, let's say the nicer way of betraying him would be to start and play with him also, like he played with what he was interested in too. So try and create our own little machines with what he has written, and he has written a lot. He has written poems. He has written, of course, the text that we know. He has written a couple of pseudo scholarly texts in the late 1960s because he had to find his place somehow. But as soon as he could, he threw them away. So yeah, that would be the option too. And for me, I've always I always try in every single one of my books to at least make one reference to Baudrillard, but I never comment on Baudrillard, or I never try to explain Baudrillard. Simply, it's there, as part of my own universe. As in his own universe, you could always find traces of Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, for instance. The aphorisms of Lichtenberg who are so important in it, or the fragments of Novalis, whom he eventually translated. People like that were everywhere in Baudrillard, but that Baudrillard never commented. He never wrote a chapter on Lichtenberg's aphorisms or on the Schlegel brothers' fragments and so on and so forth. It was simply there. I think that for us, it should be there also, like some kind of a reminder. At the moment when you take yourself a little bit too seriously, and then you look at your Baudrillard shelf. I've this just there at the level of my eye. I have one full meter of Baudrillard just there, and it says, okay, cut the crap, man. Let's have fun. And if you want a personal story, I published in French a couple of years ago a series of unpublished conversations that he had, and I had long conversations with Baudrillard's widow, Marine Baudrillard, at the moment when we decided what to include in this book and so on and so forth. And she, of course, she insisted in saying, I don't want any preface or introduction by a scholar or so. I don't want anything. Jean would have hated it. And please, don't transform that into some kind of a academic, publication. Otherwise, it would be, it was not how he was, and it is not how his book are, and so it is not also how it should be read. And I think she was perfectly right.
Good morning, Mr. Orwell. Bonjour, Monsieur Orwell.
Disneyland is a perfect model of all the entangled orders of simulation. To begin with, it is a play of illusions and phantasms, pirates, the frontier, future world, etc. But what draws the crowds is undoubtedly much more the social microcosm, the miniaturized and religious reveling in real America, and its delights and drawbacks. You park outside. Inside, a whole range of gadgets magnetize the crowd into direct flows. Outside, solitude is directed onto a single gadget, the automobile.
So you discreetly just have the spirit of Baudrillard and your meter-long library hovering near you, whereas I am doing the opposite thing, which is being very specific about Baudrillard, trying to extract some of the things that I have read in his books that have meant a lot to me and apply them here like a machine. And therefore, as part of my project here, and part of the reason that I've invited you, I want to extract from you some knowledge and information, contra to everything that you just said to me. For our viewers, who most of whom I'm sure will be utterly versed in Baudrillard, know everything that we're talking about much better than us, but others might not. And I always, in fact, it took me a lot of different, I read The Perfect Crime first, then I read other texts, but I would say it was only after I had read about 7-8 Baudrillard texts that the words he uses, the particular terms he uses, I suddenly began to understand what they meant. And it felt to me a bit like watching some long-form TV series. You come in halfway through, who are all the characters? That's what sometimes his concepts, things like hyperreality, fatality, transparence. You think you know what those words mean. Well, not in the case of hyperreality. Well, you think you know what those words mean, and they don't mean that thing at all. In fact, you can never pin down exactly what he means for the reasons that you've given beforehand. But just to step out of this fascinating discourse and just to do me the favor of doing a quick primer would be very helpful to me. Just some key terms. The most key, I think, is what is hyperreality?
Yeah. Key terms is a way of putting it. Baudrillard himself spoke about what he called mot de passe in French. So it's literally it's keywords, but the type of keywords that you have to type so that you unlock your message box or whatever. So it's mot de passe.
Okay.
It's not simply a keyword. It's literally something that allows you to.
Okay.
And indeed, hyperreality is one of these keywords. It's part of the type of cosmology almost, which is at the same time a cosmology and an epistemology or a theory of knowledge that he has in mind, which is deliberately anti-Platonistic, while being somehow weirdly faithful to Platonism, meaning okay, there's reality, whatever that is, and there's the second layer of lie, so to speak, which is the layer of simulation, and then there's a third layer that he adds to the picture, which is the layer of the simulation itself, so to speak, or the simulation within, or the simulation within simulation of the idea of reality that he calls hyperreality. And of course, with the idea of hyperreality, suddenly the first reality vanishes completely, is completely sucked out of itself in favor of the circulation in some kind of a an obscure ether, which is of course the ether today of the digital, but not only the digital. When Baudrillard spoke about hyperreality, the internet was not yet really existing anyway.
Yes, it's amazing. The text he wrote in the early 1980s about clones, about the internet before there was an internet, truly a prophetic aspect to what he wrote.
It was not. I don't think it was prophetic. Maybe we can discuss that. I think it was simply realistic in its observation of how reality was used as a category that recovered, everything of a layer of meaning and signification that had nothing to do with anything anymore. It's the ministers at the television coming at you and saying, okay, now we have to be, and when someone loves you, we have to be realistic. We have to, we have to eat a little bit less or to use less gas because that's reality.
Yes, you're right. And in fact, it shows, although people can say that Baudrillard is just a playful and perverse person, in fact, what you just said is completely true. He's a very hard-headed realist. And in following things up to the nth degree, you're right. I was wrong to say it's prophetic. It's just, well, let's properly logically analyze all these stages and what it's going to lead to. And he's right. Yes, I agree. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and let's refuse all these discourses that pass for realistic, whereas they simply want to impose a certain fantasy of reality that then subjugates everyone and puts everyone in the position of the subject of another subject. So in the position of object of some kind of a mega subject somewhere else. So for me, strangely enough, this idea of hyperreality, and it's not the only point where I think there's the same, we can make the same sort of observation or constatation. It's very close to Lacan, as a matter of fact. Very close to decide the difference between the real and the imaginary, in Lacan. So where what is called reality is an imaginary, let's say, category, and the idea of hyperreality is the materialization in the everyday world of the imaginary dimension of what is called reality, and the kind of forgetting of the real, that is precisely the object that seduces us, and that's the moment when there's something like the real that cuts through the veil of hyperreality. So there's some kind of a parallel there.
Yes, although for me, another bit of Baudrillard that blew my mind and that I love so much, and again, it came from The Perfect Crime. I had known a bit about Baudrillard from the Matrix movies. Oh yes, there's reality, but then there's a layer of fakeness on top of it. But that's not at all what he says. And in fact, in The Perfect Crime is not the murder of reality. The perfect crime is the murder of imaginary and fantasy. And his big objection to digital technology often is that it reifies, that it makes real our fantasies. So we don't have to have them privately ourselves and know that they're not real. We can see them on the screen. They can be rendered by third parties. We can see our fantasies, even to the extent now of typing in prompts into AI generators and therefore we lose not just the sense of our private imaginations, but we lose the sense that used to give us, which is, it's all very well calling the real world real, but it's just a consensual fantasy that allows things to get done and us to, in the end, stave off the fear of death. So we pretend we live in society. We pretend that your name's Laurent and my name's Susanna and that we live in our book-lined places. All that doesn't really exist. But we've forgotten that all that doesn't really exist. More and more, especially, for example, as we define ourselves online, as we say, these are my meta tags, as if, for example, we go on dating services and say, I'm like this, I'm like that. We forget that we're not like that at all. We have to inhabit exactly the meta tags. And in the end, the other great thing one of the many great things that he says, in the end, who do we do this? To whose benefit do we do this? For the machines of capitalism, not even from, as it was in the past, the masters, the human masters, but the human masters have given over their agency to computers who can do the calculations more efficiently and get more money from them. And these things have decided it's in the interests of reaping our money and labor and attention to make us categorize and to believe in the one world and not be able to step out as we used to do, often with our lovers, to say to this real world.
Hi, time for timer.
Electrical engineers are now exploring the entire spectrum of science for new developments to delight us with mass production and make possible price reduction.
The machines are not outside of us. So it's also the machine inside of us, or the machine in us, to whom we subject ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Since we're also absolutely, we're also lost inside ourselves. If something comes along and says, I can logically order you, there's a tremendous temptation to give yourself wholly over to this thing that says, I can logically order you. So there's lots of other Baudrillard terms that I could ask you to give definition of, but I don't feel like doing that at the moment. I feel like asking you, are you a subject or an object?
I don't know, and that's the only thing I could say. I don't know how you feel, Susanna. Personally, I could not reply. I could not give a clear answer to that. Perhaps because giving a clear answer would already be a way to avoid the fatality, of my own becoming. The fatality of the movement in which I'm taken. I might end up somewhere as an object or a subject, but probably in my grave or something like that. I don't know.
Well, if you're asking me, I think, if I were truly an object, what I would say is, perhaps I'm a subject, perhaps I'm an object, because the opposition isn't subject-object. The opposition is clear answer, not clear answer. But I think, as a Western woman, highly educated, surrounded by books. I've been told I'm a subject. I've been told that I'm so lucky to be born in this age where I'm allowed to consider myself a subject, because it wasn't always that way for people with my physiognomy. But increasingly, and particularly in reading Baudrillard, I feel like, who can be a subject? Who knows anything about what's going on? And I am very tempted by the route of just, let's call it as a piece of performance art, wholly considering myself as an object, although I think that this won't work out fully in the end. I might not get my shopping done, basically. So that would be my answer to that. But let me say, it's fun to be able to hang up the desire to be the subject. There is fun in thinking there's other ways of being. It's not wholly necessary to be in this way.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's the thing, with Baudrillard, it's always about something that when he makes a distinction, it's always in some kind of enveloped inside something else, And here it's if you make a distinction, the distinction isn't not supposed to have a heuristic power in itself, but has an importance in how it provokes thought, of course, but also how it makes ourselves irritated or uncomfortable, and so on and so forth. So there's the distinction has a provocative dimension to it, or it's not about describing a world in more refined, with more refined terms or categories, but trying to very arbitrarily make some kind of a cut and see what happens if we divide, the world in black and white and subject and object and all these these divisions. They are to be taken as ways for doing something else, and most of it for Baudrillard was indeed having fun as the fun or comedy or this old dimension that has been forgotten in the Western philosophical tradition, which is obsessed with tragedy, with the fact that things in the end come together. The fact that if we want to do anything, it's precisely in the cracks of the tragedy, in the slippery of the banana peel on the ground and so on and so forth, that thing will happen. That's a pataphysical dimension of Baudrillard's thought. The metaphysics, for those who don't know what it is, was, it's the imaginary science of the absence of solutions, and it's not a science. Of course, it was a creation of a French novelist, Alfred Jarry, who decided that one of his characters would invent pataphysics and would be a specialist in pataphysics. The only thing is that a group of people, mostly people with a wicked sense of humor, decided to create some kind of a society out of it. Society of people who love silly jokes, who love writing exercises with constraints and so on and so forth. And they call themselves the college of the Pataphysics College, the Collège de Pataphysique. Baudrillard was a member, and very early member of it. And in the idea of the imaginary science for the absence of solution, or of the absence of solution, the totality of what Baudrillard wanted to do is, encapsulated in this. That's why the pataphysical dimension of his work is so important and connects all the dots. It's about some kind of an attitude, perhaps, and it's not a critical attitude. It's an attitude which is more the attitude of the dancer, or the attitude of the seducer. That's why the topic of seduction is so important, and so also reversed in his work.
So knowing all this, having read Baudrillard, knowing about theories of seduction and play, has that helped you in your personal life?
I think it's a question of, it was a matter of connection. When I read it, there was something that was missing, and especially when I started reading Baudrillard, it was, let's face it was in the late 1990s. He was still alive, and every time that there would be an event in the world, either the Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, or 2000, the September 11th, or anything that would happen in France, I would go to the newsstand and try and get either Le Monde or Libération, because I knew that in the coming days there would be a chance that there would be, a column by Baudrillard saying something, that would irritate everybody, and that would have no connection whatsoever with what the traditional columnists, the editors writing their op-eds at the opening of the newspaper, the politicians and the intellectuals would say. Like in 2001 when he said that the Twin Towers, fell down under the weight of their own, shame. What's the relationship with what's the with the actuality? The fact that it was the USA, is Al Qaeda, and so on. So what? And for me, it was liberating. So the way I felt about Baudrillard was also a sense of we can breathe and we can say whatever, because what matters is not the truthfulness of what we say, but what matters is how it opens up possibility of fabricating our world in a more imaginative and playful way. So that's how most of the time I reacted to his writing when he was around. I was very sad personally when he was away, because when he eventually died, because I said, okay, nobody would do that anymore. The world will become the commentaries and the discussions about the world will stick to the world again, and the type of elasticity, the type of plastic relationship that Baudrillard would introduce in our relationship with the world would suddenly vanish. So I always come back to that. I'm sorry, maybe it's not very very helpful for those who want a 101 on Baudrillard, but I think if you don't get that, it's useless to speak about the concepts, because applying the Baudrillard's concept as if it was Pierre Bourdieu's, habitus or Derrida's deconstruction, it cannot be applied anyway, would be pointless, would be completely missing the point, because what Baudrillard requires from you is from you to invent your own machine, your own vocabulary, your own crazy distinctions and absurd and provocative interpretations that are really whatever. In French, it's this expression n'importe quoi. N'importe quoi means whatever, but it's also whatever, like whatever. And indeed, there was something like the potentiality of whateverness.
Of computer cards that retain your preferred sequences, of the genetic code that controls your combinations, of cells that inform your sensory universe. It is to this truth that the Loud family was subjected by the medium of TV, and in this sense it amounts to a death sentence, but is it still a question of truth? End of the panoptic system. The eye of TV is no longer the source of an absolute gaze, and the ideal of control is no longer that of transparency.
What that means to me is dissolving the real world. That is a fatal strategy. Now, I just want to say thank you for that answer. That was a very excellent answer of the public realm, of public discourse. But in fact, I was also asking you personally, having read, for example, let me find it, although it's not necessarily exactly about seduction as we might want to do it. Having read Seduction, having read other texts of Baudrillard, have you been able to apply those in your personal life? Has that made a difference in your own personal relations? And I am also interested in theory, and being so very much involved in theory, and I speak here for myself, can often be a somewhat distancing tool in our relationships with other people. So that's two questions. The first question is, having read Baudrillard, has it helped you, hindered you, had any impact at all in your most personal relationships? And secondly, actually, I forgot what my second question was. What was it? Oh, yeah. Being too theoretical, can that be a kind of condom against the mess of the world?
Okay, for the first question, I have a very, very, very simple answer, which is the fact that actually I met my wife thanks, Baudrillard played a role in me meeting my wife, because our first it was not a date, because we were in the same class in the university in Paris, and there was some kind of a missed rendezvous between us, and I felt it was frustrating, so I invited her for coffee, and before I would leave Paris for going back to Belgium, and I would give her, and I did give her, a copy of Baudrillard's small book, which is called Metaphysics. Mm-hmm. And it was a strange trigger because she was just, what is that? What does this man want from me? You know,
which man, Baudrillard or you?
Me. You have this little pink. In French, it's a small kind of pink book. If you want, I can show it to you. So it's very small. It's 20 pages. It's only you want to see it?
I haven't read it. Yeah, show me.
It's this, you know.
Okay.
It's and every page is in mirror.
Okay, I've got to read it.
So,
I will go and look at it.
Okay. So it's a text that he wrote when he was very young, and when he entered precisely the Collège de Pataphysique. And it's nothing about love or sex or seduction in this text, but I felt that I was so much into that, and there was in this text something that resonated so much with me that I wanted just to share it. Mm-hmm. And of course, she read it. She tried to find an explanation or something to understand about me in it. Mm-hmm. and it was a failure. So,
but nevertheless, you're married. So she.
So yeah, we have been married for 13 years. Yeah.
Congratulations.
So it means that misunderstanding somehow, at least at the beginning, and perhaps augmented misunderstanding with the years is the best thing that can happen to you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And as for my second question about the turn of too much theory being a way of not engaging emotionally with the world, what do you think about that?
I don't know. I've always said that it depends on who you are, I suppose, but I've always had books between me and the world. Mm-hmm. But this between, to some extent, might be understood as precisely the place of the world. Mm-hmm. The world is not something that you will touch one day, or that you will fully experience in your full conscience and so on. So we are, and Baudrillard has very well described that we are media creatures, prosthetic creatures that work with precisely fictions and imaginations and false things that we have created in fantasies and phantasms and so on and so forth. So I would rather say that books, at least for me, but maybe you have a different experience, Susanna, actually, precisely because they were between me and the world, actually, they allowed me to go past the world, so to speak. The other, they're in between me and the world, but then it allowed me to go on, to go above the world, encountering the world, And Baudrillard's book, from that perspective, played a huge role, because they allowed me to, I wouldn't say not take things seriously, but take them seriously according to coordinates that are not the coordinates of seriousness.
Okay, that's a very interesting answer. I would say I also love books, grew up reading books. And although I completely agree and hear what you say, and books have been my world and taken me beyond them, I recently in my life have come to feel that books have often misled me. And what books say, they echo what the times that they were written in have said. And I'm part of why I'm doing this project, and a question and interrogation I have, and a reason that I love Baudrillard, because he addresses it, and in fact we haven't talked about it here, is I'm quizzical and questioning about the whole concept of love, for example. And I feel that in many ways, books have told me a lot about love. And I'm talking here about books that are 19th century books, 18th century books are slightly different, and especially French 18th century books, and I'm thinking here of Dangerous Liaisons, amongst other books. French books of the 18th century say something different, but 19th century, 20th century, 21st century, they give a story about love that I don't think is true, or at least that I feel is worthy of interrogation. Something that I love in Baudrillard is that he gave me permission to interrogate these things, because he interrogated these things. What he, and reading him, and not just Baudrillard, but some of the reading of Baudrillard I've done has helped me to see that love is an invention, love is a useful strategy, love is a way to keep us, that what I feel that is in the past, in the deep past, people didn't understand their state-sanctioned relationships as being love in the way that we do today. They were pragmatic arrangements, and they were done with people of your similar caste, social position. And if you found love, it was often unrecorded, illegal affairs outside of that, truly secret, places that you absolutely wouldn't go into. Whereas if we're talking about hyperreality, one of the things that is hyperrealized is also our emotions. And Valentine's Day, the whole culture of love, the whole showing of that, for example, on Instagram, and therefore us taking that, which is a digital representation, and trying to enact it between each other is, I think, in many ways a problematic idea. And perhaps we don't have full time to do justice to talking about these. Baudrillard opposes love with seduction. He says love is a Christian invention. It's an emotion. It's an ideal. It's not so interesting to him. It's something that can't be verified. Whereas seduction, which has always got such a bad name, is a game. It's a place that you play in private with rules with somebody else. The main rule, it seems to me, that Baudrillard seems to discern from it is you mustn't drop the ball, that it's a game of you say this, I say that. Neither of us will talk straight because that would be to enter the false world of reality. We'll talk obliquely and play around it, and we'll see where that ends us up. That can obviously also have lots of problematic issues to it. But even the fact of criticizing love, talking about how our ideas of love don't match up is very interesting to me. So I think that I have imbibed a lot of information about love, and I have constructed my life based on a lot of fantasies about love that, in fact, are worth questioning. I will put it. I would put it like that to you. So, books and the life of theory in the mind has been useful and good to me, but I think sometimes it has been a distortion, and it hasn't always been useful and helpful to me. So there you go.
Yeah, perhaps you loved books.
Perhaps I love books, and perhaps that's enough, and perhaps that is enough, but that isn't the story that the books always told me, or the story that I told myself based on those books. But maybe that's a story that I'm telling myself now. I certainly love Baudrillard, or at least I love my idea of Baudrillard. Every so often I'm reading it, I'm loving it, and then there's some blanket statement will come out where it's clear that actually he's addressing his books, and I think this is true, to men. And there's something where he talks about women as an entirely separate another category. And when I encounter those things, it makes me feel a bit pulled up against it. But apart from that, I would say I do love Baudrillard. So there you go.
I brought one called Fatal Strategies, about things one might do under such conditions. Now, he thinks that just, rather than this being occasion for some deep gloom, the ecstasy of communication means that we should go ahead and realize that America has won the Cold War. America is utopia realized. This is the country everyone dreamed of. It is, of course, with all that we know that goes along with it now, it turns out to be, like all utopias, sadly disappointing. But weren't they always? Weren't they always, every utopia, in some sense boring and sadly disappointing?
Now, my take on that would be that I felt seduced by Baudrillard,
yeah.
and I don't think that yeah, indeed, because love is a state of affair, and Baudrillard again was more interested in movement, in the type of dance that changes the position of the partners in a given setting, but a setting with which you play at the same time that you're playing with your partner, so that you are redefining precisely the rules of the game as you're playing it. But again, this comes, of course, from as you said, from 17th and 18th century literature, and especially, kind of libertine literature. You mentioned the liaison dangereuse, or dangerous liaison, but there's a whole, current of libertine literature, not erotic literature, but libertine literature that was very much part of Baudrillard's DNA, as much as the French moralists who were somehow contemporary to this literary production.
Yes, yes.
So when you read Chamfort, La Rochefoucauld, of course, Rivarol, Vauvenargues, they're contemporary to, I don't know, Mirabeau, or, I don't know, some anonymous works, Le Portier des Chartreux, and so on and so forth, André Adnercia, so all these things. And it's as if moralism in Ancien Régime France could be understood only in its erotic mirror, and vice versa. And,
so
and
interesting.
I think that Baudrillard was the one who tried to combine the two, with a little dash of German romantic irony on top of it, and the wit of the German romantics.
Something he says in Fatal Strategies that I love very much is he says it is only by the game of seduction that one sex does not dominate the other sex, that it is only when you play with the roles afforded to you that suddenly the playing field becomes level, that you are both playing a game in which you both have equal different, if I'm not contradicting what I said earlier, but you both have high stakes in that game, and it's not that one has dominance over the other. I want briefly and cheekily to say to you, you've been married for 13 years and you met your wife, from what I can just understand, in a class. So I'm guessing you haven't done much in the realm of internet dating. You haven't, I wonder if you have at all facilitated yourself with the delights of digital love, digital dating, if any of that is au courant with you, and if so, or if not, what your thoughts and opinions are about all that.
No, I've it happens in the world, so I've had a look at it, but I must confess that I simply don't get it. So maybe I'm too 20th century. I don't get it. I don't get it.
What don't you get?
I don't get the picture and the self. I don't get the fact that it's about ourselves. It's not about a type of story that I'm telling to someone, or a type of dynamic that happens when meeting someone. It's not. It's about selling yourself. It's not about cheating with yourself in order to, displace you in the different realm, which is precisely the realm of seduction. So I can understand that Baudrillard was very was not amused with this evolution when he saw it at the end of his life, because there's a return to. It's an old metaphysics, which is the metaphysics of being. The idea that indeed we would be what we are, and that this is the defeat, the absolute defeat in terms. If you're Baudrillardian, to believe that you are what you are, to believe that you are who you are.
Yes,
you're done.
Yes, that's why he doesn't like psychotherapy, for example. Being locked inside the prison of yourself, working out who you are, who is best for you, what is best for you. Whereas, as he says,
inside the fantasy of yourself, that becomes a fantasy of your world, and the fantasy of the other, and then of course the other does not exist actually in a discourse like that.
Also, you will always not know enough about yourself, and the image I always get is being locked up behind walls, trying to discover who you are. Whereas the joy, the pleasure is breaking the walls, having an encounter with something completely different to you, and through that experiencing joy and pleasure, which this defining world of anyway.
Yeah, and being expelled from yourself by the encounter with someone or something or whatever. It's your kick, I think that's the thing that's not working with online or app dating as far as I know it. But it has become more and more difficult to say such kind of thing without sounding like old pacifists and reactionary.
Fuddy duddy. Yes,
yeah.
That's what.
That's embarrassing too. But I still feel it, and when you have to fill in all these forms with who you are, what you have done, and then now you have people coaching you in how to present yourself in your tagline so that you can be more attractive and so on and so forth. Plus, of course, there's the thing that depending on how much you pay, you can be upgraded or not. So it reproduced completely the hierarchy of capitalism. Then, of course, the hierarchy of flesh capitalism, so to speak. So are you attractive or not? Can you pay a good photographer to have, amazing, glowing pictures? And so
And also, what I always feel about it is you're never going to state your desire. You're in a public space. Your boss might see it. Your mum might see it. You are never going to state. And in any case, you would never state your private desire. You state your private desire.
Even if you state them, desires are not what can be stated. I mean, it's
exactly.
Psychoanalytical 101,
exactly.
you know? The desires are things that go through you, and then that you are the object of somehow. So
exactly.
What I want is that, in terms of desire, sexuality, or whatever, is just sheer
obscene. It is obscene. One of the terms I was going to ask, but I think we're running out of our time here, but I was going to ask you to talk about obscenity and what it means. And what I understand is his definition of obscenity is exactly that. When there is no skin between your personal, you think there's no skin between what's going on inside you and what goes on outside you, when you just show everything about yourself, when you become, as it were, transparent, that is obscenity. And so what you're talking about there, to me, feels like obscenity. And that is real obscenity rather than, any other definition that we might like to give of it. And also, it's just untrue, as you said. It's just untrue. We just can't do that. I cannot tabulate to you every single desire that I have inside myself and represent it as a coherent whole. It's not how any of us are. It's not how the universe is. Anyway, I think we're coming to the end of our very interesting chat. Thank you so much. I wonder if you've got any questions for me. How has it been going on this date? Is it how you expected it to be?
Oh, I'm always up for anything that happens. So it was great having you. Of course, it's nice. It's nice that you have your own experience. I would be curious to also know how you managed to. If Baudrillard played also a wicked role at some point in your life, that would be interesting to know if one of those books played a...
Well, how interesting that you say that, and how very convenient for me, because right now for Sublation Media, I'm writing a book, Dating Tips from Baudrillard, which is constructed as some dating tips that I have learned from Baudrillard, but it's also a story of how I encountered Baudrillard, of how I was seduced by him, about how I misread him, about how he may or may not have helped me in my emotional life. So what can I say, Laurent? You're just going to have to wait another year, and then you can purchase it from Sublation Media. You can find out all about it there. How about that?
Excellent.
Thank you for the thing. Say again.
The best commercial ever.
I don't know. See, now I don't know where I'm going with this. This is what David
Foster
Wallace.
Sorry, but I'm feeling like this date hasn't gone well for you at all, Dragster. And what I'm feeling is that I have forced you. Reading between the lines here of my date, I would go home with and call my friend after and say, the poor guy. I feel that I forced him to speak in a way that he didn't want to. That he was on camera and he was presenting. Suddenly, his certainties about who he was, his personas, had all started to slip. He became. He unmoored somewhat. He wasn't a natural space for him. Would that be?